there, it's me, SpongeBob. Welcome to Sleepy Sponge Lore, a place where the secrets of Bikini Bottom drift like dreams beneath the waves. So take a deep breath, get comfy, and let the ocean carry you to sleep. Let the video begin.
The beginning of every story feels a little strange, like stepping into a dream that has been waiting for you. This one begins under the water, where the light was bending softly that day, and the world seemed to hum with a secret that only SpongeBob could hear. He had woken the way he often did, heart full of a curiosity that bubbled louder than the sea itself, eyes wide as though every morning was a gift he'd never unwrapped before. Outside his pineapple house, the water shimmered faintly, as though it had been touched by something new. He couldn't name it, but he felt it in the way the current pressed at his skin, whispering change. It wasn't the kind of change that frightened him.
No, SpongeBob never truly feared the unknown.
He greeted the strange with the same open arms he used for friends, for jellyfish, even for the smallest detail in the quiet corners of Bikini Bottom. His neighbors thought him a little peculiar, sometimes even too excitable. But what they didn't always understand was that for SpongeBob, every oddity in the world was an invitation. And so that morning, when he felt the tide tugging at him to wander, he smiled as if an old friend had knocked on his door. He set off humming a tune, the kind without words, the kind that rises up from somewhere deep inside, like a bubble drifting toward the surface. The jellyfish fields weren't far, and often he lost himself there, chasing sparks of pink and blue as though they carried pieces of laughter. But today the water pulled him further. He passed through coral groves he had rarely walked among, their twisting shapes like frozen fireworks of the sea. He brushed his hand along them lightly, as if greeting old souls. The current carried him to a clearing, a quiet stretch of sea floor where the sand gleamed brighter than usual, almost as though light was spilling from within it. And there, in the center of that hush, was something he had never seen. It was not made of coral or stone, not grown from the deep ocean.
It was built.
A great dome rising from the sand, glimmering with a faint, otherworldly sheen. Within its clear walls, things shifted and swayed, but not as they should.
No water moved inside, no fish swam, no kelp bent with the current.
Instead, there was a strange stillness. SpongeBob tilted his head, his wide eyes drinking it in, and for a long moment he simply floated there, forgetting to blink. The dome seemed alive, breathing in silence. A childlike wonder stirred in him. He whispered softly to himself, because sometimes his own voice kept him steady when faced with mystery. "What are you, little bubble?" His hand pressed against the dome's surface. Warm, solid, unlike anything the sea had offered him before. His reflection stared back, small and curious, mouth parted as though waiting for answers. And then
movement. Not his own, but something from within.
a shadow shifted among the strangeness inside, crossing the dome's floor. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't any creature SpongeBob had seen. The figure walked upright, with steady steps, and there was a grace to the movement that made him hold his breath. His heart beat faster, not with fear, but with a fragile thrill, like the moment before a bubble bursts. When it hangs between sky and sea, she came closer, though at that time he didn't yet know her name, didn't yet know what place she would carve into his story. The figure wore a suit, strange and white, with a helmet round as a bubble itself. Through its glass he glimpsed eyes, kind but determined, carrying a spark that matched the unfamiliar world she walked in. She paused, noticing him just as he noticed her, and for an instant they stood on opposite sides of silence, 2 worlds apart, staring through a wall as delicate as glass, as unyielding as fate. SpongeBob smiled first. He always did. Not the polite kind, not the practiced kind, but the kind that spilled from him like sunlight through clear water. He lifted his hand in a shy wave, unsure if she would understand.
And, almost hesitantly, she raised hers back. That single gesture was enough to stitch something invisible between them.
A thread fine and delicate yet strong. He didn't yet know that this thread would pull him into the air, into moments of laughter and breathless trial, into memories that would stay with him like seashells tucked away in his pocket. All he knew was that the stranger had waved back, and it made him feel less alone in the mystery. He lingered there, pressing his face against the dome, peering into that dry world where things grew in ways the sea had never taught him. Tall green stalks reached for the sky, leaves broad and trembling without water to hold them steady. Rocks sat uncovered, not softened by coral or anemone, but bare and rough, like something stripped to its truth. And there, among it all, she stood, watching him, with a tilt of her head, as if wondering about the odd little sponge with the wide eyes who had wandered too far from home. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt like a pause before words, like the inhale before a gentle song. SpongeBob's mind swirled with questions. What was this place? Who was she? How could such a bubble exist beneath the ocean? Yet his heart told him to wait, to simply feel the wonder rather than rush it. He thought of childhood afternoons when he would sit in the fields, staring up at jellyfish drifting lazily overhead, not needing to chase them, only watching. This moment was like that, enough to be present, to let the world unfold slowly. He whispered again, almost to himself, though perhaps the dome carried the vibration. Hello. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clever. But sometimes the simplest words carry the greatest weight. Inside, she didn't reply. Perhaps she couldn't through the glass, but she placed her hand firmly against the dome, mirroring his. Two palms separated by a barrier, yet somehow touching all the same. And in that silent exchange, SpongeBob felt it. The beginning of something. Not just friendship, not just curiosity. Something that would echo. The water around him seemed to grow stiller, as if holding its breath too. The sand beneath him shimmered faintly in the filtered light, and he thought, with a sudden wave of tenderness, that the sea had brought him here on purpose. That life had steered him toward this dome, this stranger, this fragile connection waiting to be born. He smiled wider, cheeks warming in a way the water could not hide. And though the story was only beginning, he already knew, deep down with the certainty of tides, that he would return to this place again and again. That this moment was not an ending, but a door opening slowly in the silence. For some beginnings arrive not with noise or fanfare, but with a quiet touch on the glass. A first wave, a held gaze, a secret smile between two unlikely souls. And that is how SpongeBob's journey began that day, standing before the Treedome, heart open, spirit ready, unknowingly stepping into a chapter of his life that would change the shape of his days forever. The memory of the dome lingered with him long after he drifted away from it. The sight of the figure inside pressing gently against his thoughts like a seashell tucked into the palm of his hand. SpongeBob carried it home the way one carries a melody, unconsciously, humming it to himself, letting it shape the rhythm of his steps. Yet, as he floated along the familiar streets of Bikini Bottom, a quieter part of him stirred, pulling him into reflection. To meet something so new, so unlike anything in his world, had stirred echoes of older curiosities, the kind he had felt even as a small sponge. He remembered the days of his own childhood, when the sea had seemed impossibly large. Back then, he hadn't known where his edges ended or what purpose waited for him beyond the soft glow of jellyfish drifting through the fields. He had grown up chasing them, laughing as their delicate movements seemed to carry entire stories in silence. Sometimes he would reach out his small, porous hands and feel their gentle sting, not painful, just a reminder that even beauty had its mysteries. Those afternoons had shaped him. Though he hadn't realized it at the time, they taught him to chase without clinging, to admire without needing to hold too tightly. In those years, he also learned the ways of kindness. His grandmother's voice often returned to him in memory, soft and steady, telling him that the sea itself was alive and that every creature carried feelings, even if they couldn't speak them. He believed her, because the sea always seemed to shift with his moods. When he was sad, the water pressed heavier, as if cradling him. When he was happy, it danced with him, carrying bubbles higher than he could ever blow alone. That belief had blossomed into a way of living, of seeing hearts everywhere, even in places where others saw only strangeness. It was this quiet history that stirred now as he thought about the figure inside the dome. She had been unfamiliar, yes, but not frightening. She carried something in her stance, in her gaze, that reminded him of the jellyfish drifting overhead. Foreign, yet strangely tender. He wondered if she too saw hearts in unexpected places. The thought carried him into the evening, where the soft glow of his pineapple home greeted him. He lay on his bed that night, staring upward, as though the ceiling might part to reveal the sky above. His breath slowed, bubbles rising gently toward the roof, and in the quiet he whispered again the word he had spoken earlier at the dome. Hello. It echoed back to him faintly, not from the walls but from memory. He smiled into the silence and drifted into dreams. The days that followed moved gently, like the tide pulling back and forth. SpongeBob went about his routines, working at the Krusty Krab, tidying his little home, greeting his neighbors with the bright cheerfulness that bubbled naturally from him. Yet beneath it all, a steady thread pulled at him. Every laugh he shared, every Krabby Patty he flipped, every jellyfish he chased, seemed touched by the memory of that encounter. It wasn't distraction, not exactly. It was more like carrying a secret he wasn't ready to put into words.
A secret that filled him not with weight, but with lightness.
As if at any moment it might lift him a little higher off the sand. And so, when the pull returned a few days later, guiding him once more past the coral groves and into the clearing, he followed without hesitation. The dome was waiting, gleaming softly as before, a quiet world pressed against his own. He pressed his hand to the glass again, the same way he had the first time. And again, she was there. This time she was closer, waiting almost as if she had expected him. Her eyes brightened when she saw him. He could feel it, even through the strange glass of her helmet. SpongeBob grinned so wide that his cheeks nearly folded into themselves. He waved and she waved back, but then she did something new. She gestured. Slowly, carefully, she beckoned him. SpongeBob tilted his head, unsure. The dome had seemed so impenetrable, a world sealed away. But now she was pointing toward something near its base, a door-like shape he hadn't noticed before. He felt the thrill of discovery rush through him. For a moment he hesitated, glancing back at the wide expanse of sea around him, the comfort of the world he knew so well. Then he turned back, saw her waiting, and his choice was made. He stepped closer, curious fingers brushing over the outline of the hatch. It opened with a gentle shift, and bubbles streamed out as though sighing at the intrusion. His heart thudded in his chest, though not from fear. It was the thrill of stepping into something entirely new. Inside, he found himself surrounded by air. It pressed differently against him, heavier somehow, and for a moment he struggled to draw it in. His body, used to the embrace of water, felt clumsy and awkward here.
He gasped, his limbs trembling as though trying to remember what it meant to move.
Yet, even in that struggle he saw her, close now, steadying him with a hand, eyes filled not with judgment, but with care. She didn't speak words he could understand. Not yet. But she guided him gently, showing him how to take small breaths, how to pace himself. It was strange. Uncomfortable at first, but her presence steadied him. SpongeBob thought back to those childhood lessons, how beauty often carried a little sting, how newness always came with awkwardness before wonder revealed itself. And so he laughed, even as he stumbled, because to him even difficulty was something to embrace. She laughed too, a soft sound muffled by her helmet, and in that moment they were no longer strangers, but companions in discovery. SpongeBob noticed the little details of her world as he steadied himself. The way the trees swayed without water, the rustle of leaves like whispers instead of the song of currents. The air smelled different too, faintly sharp, carrying a crispness he had never tasted before. He touched the ground and found it dry, the grains of sand coarse without the soft cushion of water. Everything felt raw, startling, yet wondrous. He thought about how small he must look in this world, how clumsy. And yet she didn't laugh at him. She laughed with him, as though his awkwardness was simply another part of the story unfolding. That small kindness filled him with warmth, deeper than any ocean current could carry. The memory of that first breath inside her dome would stay with him always. Not because it was perfect, far from it, but because it was real. It was the beginning of trust, of learning to belong in a place that wasn't built for him, guided by someone who saw not his strangeness, but his openness. As the evening light shifted, casting soft shadows through the Treedome, SpongeBob felt the same certainty he had felt the first time he pressed his hand to the glass, that this was the start of something gentle and lasting, a thread tying two unlikely lives together. He didn't know where it would lead. He didn't need to. It was enough to know that he wasn't walking into it alone. The strangeness of the air clung to SpongeBob long after that first visit, settling in his memory like a dream he could not quite shake. Each breath had been a challenge, each movement awkward, and yet when he thought back on it, he did not remember the discomfort most clearly. What stayed with him was her face behind the helmet, the way her eyes lit when he laughed despite himself, the way she reached out to steady him with a gentleness that asked for nothing in return. It reminded him of the first time he had learned to ride a jellyfish net as a boy, how clumsy he had been, tumbling into the sand again and again until someone had helped him find his balance. Life always seemed to come back to those moments of reaching and being reached for, the fragile threads of kindness holding everything together. He found himself returning to the dome again, not out of obligation, but because the thought of it tugged at him like the current tugged at loose shells. Each visit began with a wave through the glass, a smile that bloomed almost on its own. She was always there, waiting in some way, as if she too had begun to carry the shape of him in her thoughts. And with each return, the barrier between their worlds seemed to grow thinner, not just of glass and water, but of the hesitations that lingered between strangers. The third time he entered the Treedome, he noticed how quickly she moved to bring him a small bowl of water, setting it beside him as though she had prepared for his arrival. He chuckled gratefully, plunging his head in with a sigh of relief before lifting it again, droplets falling onto the dry earth like little echoes of his world. She laughed softly at the sight, not mocking but amused, and there was comfort in that shared laughter. They began to find ways of speaking without words. SpongeBob, expressive as always, used wide gestures, tilting his head, pointing to things with the innocent curiosity of a child seeing the world for the first time. She responded in kind, patient, and inventive, showing him objects he had never known, acorns, leaves that crinkled in his hands, flowers that seemed to breathe a perfume he had no name for. Each time he held something new, he marveled aloud, his voice bouncing off the dome's walls, filling the air with unfiltered wonder. She didn't always understand the words, but she seemed to understand the heart behind them, and that was enough. What struck him most was how quiet her world was. In the sea there was always a hum, currents whispering, bubbles rising, the faint chatter of creatures going about their days. But here, silence lived differently. It was still almost heavy, yet not empty. When she poured him tea for the first time, he held the little cup in both hands, breathing in its warmth, the stillness around them pressing soft against his ears. He sipped carefully. The taste unlike anything he had known, earthy, delicate, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves he had never seen until now. He set the cup down slowly, almost reverently, as though afraid to break the spell.
"It's quiet here," he said, more to himself than to her.
She tilted her head, watching him with curiosity. Perhaps she did not hear the silence as he did, for she was born of it, shaped by it. But for SpongeBob it felt like stepping into a dream, one that reminded him of nights spent lying on his back, staring at the glow of the sea above, when all the noise of the world seemed to fall away until only his breathing remained. That quiet began to change him, though he did not notice it at first. He had always been a creature of noise, of laughter, of energy, of endless chatter spilling out like bubbles. But in the Treedome, he learned to sit without speaking for long stretches, to let the silence itself do the talking. He would glance at her, see her sitting comfortably beside him, and realize that he did not need to fill every gap with words. Sometimes presence was enough. Sometimes companionship meant simply being there, two beings sharing the same air, the same tea, the same moment. Still the air remained a challenge. Each visit ended with him gasping, cheeks flushed, retreating back to the sea with relief. But instead of discouraging him, it only deepened his resolve. There was something worth braving that discomfort for, something worth learning. And each time he stumbled, she was there to steady him, her care soft but sure, like the hand of the sea itself, lifting him when he drifted too low. One afternoon, as the light fell golden across the dome, SpongeBob lingered longer than usual. He felt the weight of the air pressing in, but he pushed through, eager to watch as she showed him a new skill. She placed her hands together in a stance he did not understand, then leapt into motion with a grace that startled him. Quick kicks, flowing spins, movements that seemed both precise and playful. He clapped his hands in delight, his laughter spilling out until he nearly lost his breath again. She paused, bowing slightly, and though he did not know the word for it then, he sensed that she was sharing a piece of her world's strength, a language of movement and discipline. SpongeBob tried to mimic her, of course. He wobbled, toppled, spun too fast, and fell into the sand with a puff of dust. But he laughed at himself before she could, and soon she was laughing too, helping him back to his feet. It was in those moments of trying and failing, of stumbling and rising again, that their bond deepened. He realized that he did not need to master her ways to be part of them. It was enough to try, enough to show up, enough to let her world shape him little by little. As he left that evening, stepping back into the familiar embrace of the sea, SpongeBob turned once more to look at the dome. It glowed softly behind him, its surface catching the last light like a lantern beneath the water. He felt a tug in his chest, a mixture of exhaustion and joy, as though he had carried something precious out with him. He whispered into the sea, as if it could carry his words back to her. "See you soon." The current swayed gently, almost as if answering him, and SpongeBob smiled to himself. He floated home beneath the stars that were beginning to shine faintly above the surface, his body tired, his heart full. The memory of her laughter, the warmth of tea, the silence that no longer felt heavy, all of it drifted with him, weaving into the fabric of who he was becoming. SpongeBob's visits to the Treedome became a rhythm, a quiet pulse in his days that reminded him that the world could always surprise him. Each journey through the water felt lighter than the last, not because the current had changed, but because he had begun to carry something else within himself, a thread of anticipation, of gentle courage, and of a curiosity that no longer felt fragile. He approached the dome one morning with the same mix of excitement and nerves he had felt the first time. But now there was also a sense of calm, as if he had learned to meet strangeness not with fear, but with trust. When he arrived, Sandy was already there, perched beside a small table set for tea. The air inside the dome shimmered faintly with warmth, a soft hum of life that felt almost musical. She smiled when she saw him, tilting her head in that same careful, observant way that had drawn him in before. SpongeBob returned her smile, though his own heart fluttered like a jellyfish caught in a gentle current. He knew deep down that something meaningful awaited him here, even if he didn't yet understand what it might be. The first moments were quiet, filled with the soft sound of his own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves. He held the little cup she had poured for him, savoring the heat as it seeped into his fingers, warming more than just his skin. The tea carried a flavor unlike anything he had known, a gentle, earthy note, touched by the faint sweetness of the flowers around them. As he sipped, he felt the tension in his chest ease, a weight lifting that he hadn't realized had been there. It was remarkable how something so small, a cup of tea, a smile, a quiet presence, could carry so much comfort. After a while, Sandy gestured toward the corner of the dome, where she had arranged a small collection of objects. Acorns, leaves, and stones gleamed softly in the filtered light, their textures and shapes new and strange to him. SpongeBob reached out tentatively, letting his fingers brush across the surfaces. The smoothness of a stone, the crisp edge of a leaf, the rounded warmth of an acorn, they each spoke to him in a language of curiosity that needed no translation. He lifted them, turned them over, and whispered soft observations, more to himself than to her. Each object seemed to hold a story, and he felt honored to be allowed to touch them, to witness their quiet existence. Sandy watched, eyes bright, and for a long time they shared a silence that was filled not with absence, but with understanding. SpongeBob realized he had begun to comprehend something important. Presence itself could be a conversation. They didn't need words for everything. Gestures, shared glances, and the gentle rhythm of time passing could carry meaning just as profoundly. And in that realization, he felt a sense of belonging, a quiet knowledge that he was part of this world, even if it was not the world he had known before. As the day wore on, they explored the dome together. She guided him gently, showing him how to navigate the strange terrain, how to step lightly over the dry ground, how to balance when the air felt unsteady around him. Each small act of guidance was paired with her quiet patience, and SpongeBob felt a kind of gratitude that he had not known before. It wasn't the gratitude of receiving a gift, but of being trusted, of being allowed to learn and grow in a place that had once seemed so foreign. At one point, he stumbled, nearly toppling over as he misjudged a step. Sandy was immediately there, steadying him with a hand on his arm. He laughed, a little breathless, and she laughed too, the sound warm and light in the enclosed air. SpongeBob realized that he didn't mind falling here. Not really, because the act of rising again was made easier by her presence. There was no judgment, no rush to correct him, only encouragement and shared amusement. He had never felt so safe in unfamiliar territory, and it made him wonder how much of life was waiting just beyond the edges of comfort, if only one was willing to reach for it. They sat for a while afterward, resting on the dry ground. SpongeBob traced patterns in the dust, letting his mind wander as he watched her hands move gently over the table, rearranging objects with a care that felt almost reverent. He realized that these small routines, these tiny acts, carried their own kind of magic. The dome itself seemed to pulse softly around them, not as a barrier, but as a vessel for connection, holding the moments between them like water holds a bubble. Time passed differently inside the dome. Minutes stretched, folded, and lingered, but SpongeBob didn't mind. Each breath felt precious, each glance a quiet treasure. And though the air still pressed against him with its strangeness, he no longer felt fear. He felt alive in a new way, aware of the fragility and beauty of being. of the careful steps required to move through life, and of the trust that could form between two beings when they simply met and allowed themselves to be present. As the light outside softened into evening, SpongeBob felt a gentle tug, a reminder that he would need to leave soon. He rose slowly, careful with his movements, and she mirrored him, standing to see him off. He pressed his hand lightly against the glass, and she pressed hers to meet it. For a moment, he felt as though the barrier between them had disappeared entirely. That connection and trust could transcend even the limits of physical space. He stepped back, letting the hatch close behind him, and exhaled a long, steady breath as he returned to the familiar embrace of the sea. The water felt softer than ever, the currents embracing him like an old friend. But within him, a part of the dome lingered, the warmth of her smile, the quiet joy of shared discovery, the sense that even in the most unfamiliar places, connection was possible. As SpongeBob floated home beneath the glimmer of evening light filtering through the water, he thought of how small beginnings could ripple outward, shaping the days that followed. A wave of anticipation stirred inside him, not for some grand adventure, but for the quiet continuation of what had begun here, the learning, the laughter, the shared moments of stillness that felt more profound than any clamor could ever be. That night, as he lay in his little pineapple bed, he replayed the afternoon over and over in his mind. Each gesture, each glance, each small laugh carried weight in a way that surprised him. And as he drifted into sleep, he felt a soft certainty, like the pull of the tide beneath the moonlight, that this connection, fragile as it might seem, would endure. That each return to the dome would bring new lessons, new discoveries, and new ways of feeling the world more full. He dreamed of leaves rustling without wind, of acorns balanced carefully in tiny hands, of laughter that didn't need words. And when he awoke, he felt ready again to face the water, to seek out the dome, to step once more into a world that was strange yet welcoming. The adventure wasn't in the air itself, he realized, nor in the objects, nor even in the dome. The adventure was in learning to meet it all with an open heart, in learning to step carefully yet boldly into the unfamiliar, and in discovering again and again the quiet joy of connection. The next morning, SpongeBob awoke with a quiet eagerness humming in his chest. It was not the kind of excitement that rushed through the body like electricity, nor the jittery anticipation of a day filled with obligations or noise. It was something gentler, a soft, persistent curiosity that pulled him out of bed and sent him drifting through the water toward the Treedome once more. Each visit seemed to carry a new layer of meaning, and he felt the invisible thread of connection tighten just enough to guide him forward, steady and unhurried. The sunlight slanted through the ocean, dappled across coral and sand in uneven patterns, and he floated along, humming a little tune to himself. Even the currents seemed to sense his mood, moving gently, guiding him over the familiar coral groves and past the jellyfish fields. SpongeBob paused for a moment to watch a cluster of pink jellyfish drifting lazily, their delicate tendrils trailing like fine threads of silk. He smiled softly, remembering how much he had once feared that these small, fragile creatures might sting him. Now he approached them with the same gentle curiosity he carried toward everything, trusting, observing, never needing to control. The Treedome waited for him, shining softly through the water, and he felt his chest swell with the warmth of recognition. She was already there, as if she had sensed his coming, and he waved, the small bubble of greeting floating between them. Her hand rose to meet his through the glass, a mirror of familiarity and invitation. That gesture, repeated so often now, no longer felt new or surprising. It felt like the natural pulse of their friendship, a rhythm they both understood without words. When he stepped through the hatch this time, Something had changed. The air still pressed against him, still required attention with every breath, but he felt steadier. He carried with him the memory of previous visits, the taste of tea, the warmth of shared laughter, the sensation of being guided with care, and it made him braver, more present. She gestured to him to follow, and he did without hesitation, trusting in the gentle pattern of their shared steps. They wandered together, SpongeBob learning to navigate the strange air, and she leading him with quiet patience. Today she showed him something new, a small patch of the dome where sunlight fell in patterns like scattered stars, illuminating tiny creatures moving through the dry soil. Beetles scuttled, insects hummed faintly in the heat, and leaves fluttered as though breathing in the strange, oxygen-rich world. SpongeBob crouched low to watch, fascinated, his heart opening to the subtleties of life he had never known existed outside the sea. She knelt beside him, pointing softly, showing him the movement of a leaf, the arch of a beetle's back, the faint shadow a wing cast over a stone. He reached out with his hands, careful not to disturb, and whispered observations aloud, though he wasn't sure if she needed to hear them. "Look at that," he said softly. "See how it moves, like it's alive with its own little heartbeat." She nodded, her eyes following the motion, and for a moment they were silent together, listening to the world that pulsed quietly around them. SpongeBob realized he was beginning to see her world in layers, not just as a collection of objects and air, but as a living rhythm that required attention, respect, and care. They returned to the table for tea, but the ritual felt different today. The cup she poured for him steamed gently, carrying the faint scent of earth and flowers, but his mind lingered on the lessons of the morning, the small movements, the quiet life that thrived in a place so unlike his own. He sipped carefully, letting the warmth flow through him, and when he met her gaze, he saw a quiet pride reflected there. Not for his skill or knowledge, but for his willingness to engage, to open himself fully to something unfamiliar without fear or judgment. Afterward, she led him to a small clearing at the edge of the dome, where the ground rose slightly and the light caught the leaves in a way that made them shimmer like liquid gold. Here, she gestured toward a small stack of objects, stones, sticks, and a few unfamiliar tools. SpongeBob's curiosity ignited and he moved closer, hands hovering over the items. She demonstrated a simple pattern, arranging the stones and sticks in a shape that seemed almost like a tiny structure. He tried to mimic her, faltering as he balanced one piece and another, each time it toppled over. She laughed too, soft and musical, and leaned in to help him, showing subtle adjustments with patience and care. It was in these quiet acts of trial and discovery that SpongeBob began to feel a subtle shift within himself. He realized that growth was not always loud or dramatic. It was made of repeated gestures, small lessons learned through touch and observation, and the gentle guidance of someone who believed in him. In this room of air and sunlight, under her careful eyes, he felt himself stretching in ways he had never expected. Not just physically,
but emotionally, learning to trust, to adapt,
to find patience within his own eagerness. The afternoon waned, and sunlight slanted lower across the dome, casting long shadows that danced quietly with the leaves. SpongeBob felt the familiar tug in his chest, a gentle reminder that he would soon return to the sea, to the comfort of water pressing softly against his skin. He rose slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his pants, and she mirrored him, stepping toward the hatch with him. Before leaving, he pressed his hand to the glass, and she pressed hers in response, a gesture full of unspoken understanding. It was more than greeting or farewell. It was acknowledgement, recognition, and a promise carried across the boundaries of their worlds. Back in the ocean, SpongeBob floated home under the soft shimmer of sunlight filtering through the water. The current felt different today, more fluid somehow, as though carrying him gently on its rhythm. He thought of the patterns of light, the small creatures, and the structure they had built together, and he felt a quiet swell of pride, not pride in accomplishment, but inexperience in the slow, deliberate steps of learning and connection. He knew that each visit would continue to teach him something new, that each shared moment carried a subtle weight, a ripple that would extend far beyond the Treedome's walls. That night, as he lay on his bed, he closed his eyes and replayed the day with gentle precision. The shapes of stones and sticks, the shimmer of leaves, the laughter shared in awkward moments, they wove together into a tapestry he carried within himself. Even the air, strange and unfamiliar, seemed to linger in his mind, not as discomfort, but as a reminder that growth often requires venturing beyond what feels safe. He exhaled slowly, letting the thoughts settle in the quiet of his bedroom, and smiled. Tomorrow, he knew, he would return, and the dome would hold yet another secret, another lesson, another gentle heartbeat of life he had yet to discover. The morning light filtered softly through the water, and SpongeBob awoke with a sense of quiet anticipation. The memory of yesterday's visit to the Treedome lingered like a gentle tide within him, the laughter, the careful guidance, the strange and fascinating creatures of that dry world. He rose from his bed, stretching slowly, feeling the familiar comfort of his home in the sea, and yet something tugged at him, urging him forward. The dome awaited, not with urgency, but with a soft invitation, the kind that hums beneath the awareness of the heart. He drifted through the familiar streets of Bikini Bottom, passing neighbors and friends with their usual routines, yet everything felt slightly different. The world seemed quieter, as if holding its breath, allowing him to step into something tender, something fragile, yet full of possibility. The jellyfish fields shimmered in the filtered light, and he paused for a moment, watching them drift lazily, remembering how small gestures, like a wave of his hand or a careful step, could create ripples far larger than he realized. His curiosity, patient and steady, carried him forward, like a current that knew exactly where to guide him. Arriving at the Treedome, he paused at the familiar glass, feeling its smooth surface beneath his hand. She was already inside, arranging something carefully on a small table. Her presence was calm and steady, as if she had anticipated his arrival. SpongeBob waved, his smile wide and genuine, and she lifted her hand to meet his through the glass. That simple gesture held a depth he could not yet name, a quiet understanding that had grown between them over their repeated encounters. He stepped through the hatch, feeling the air press differently against him than the water did, heavier and more deliberate. Yet he no longer felt the initial fear of entering this strange world. He had learned, slowly, that presence, trust, and patience could transform unfamiliarity into something tender, something alive. She gestured toward the space near the table, and he followed, each step careful, deliberate, yet filled with the same sense of wonder that had first drawn him here. Today, she guided him toward a small corner of the dome that he had not yet noticed, a patch of sunlight filtering through leaves, illuminating tiny insects moving among fallen petals. He crouched to observe, fascinated by the intricate patterns
of life that went unnoticed until one paused to truly look.
Beetles scuttled across the sunlit soil, leaves quivered in the airless warmth, and faint shadows danced over stones like echoes of movement. SpongeBob whispered soft observations, letting the words flow gently into the quiet space. She nodded, following his gaze, and for a long moment they simply existed together in that shared attention. Afterward, they returned to the table for tea, but it was not a rushed or casual affair. SpongeBob held the warm cup carefully, savoring the earthy, delicate taste, and allowed himself to sink into the moment. He realized that the dome itself was teaching him something subtle, how to inhabit silence, how to appreciate rhythm and movement without rushing, how to find joy in the smallest gestures. She did not need to speak, and he did not need to explain. Their connection had grown beyond words into the gentle language of observation, of presence, of care. Once the tea was finished, she led him to a small clearing where sunlight spilled in like liquid gold. Here, she presented a collection of objects, stones, sticks, and a few tools whose purposes were not immediately clear. She demonstrated arranging them in a simple, precise pattern, then gestured for SpongeBob to try. He approached with care, hands hovering over the pieces, and attempted to mimic her arrangement. His efforts faltered, stones toppled, sticks wobbled, but he laughed at each failure, and she laughed with him, the sound soft and warm, filling the still air with its gentle rhythm. As they worked together, adjusting shapes and finding balance, SpongeBob began to recognize a lesson that extended beyond the physical act. Growth, he realized, was rarely loud or dramatic. It was composed of patience, of small repeated efforts, of learning to trust the guidance of someone who cared. Each stumble and recovery carried weight, not in the fall itself, but in the act.
Of rising in the shared understanding and quiet encouragement that accompanied it.
He felt himself stretching in a subtle way, learning to adapt, to trust, to meet discomfort with patience rather than fear. Time passed almost unnoticed. The light outside shifted, painting the Treedome with long, soft shadows. SpongeBob felt the gentle tug that reminded him he would soon return to the water, to the comfort of the sea. He rose slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his arms and legs, and she rose beside him, mirroring his movements with care. Before stepping through the hatch, he pressed his hand lightly to the glass, and she pressed hers in return. It was more than greeting or farewell. It was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that their bond had deepened beyond words. Back in the ocean, SpongeBob floated gently toward home, the currents embracing him in familiar, soft rhythms. The water felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had changed within it. Each visit to the dome had left a subtle mark, a small transformation that he carried with him. Patience, awareness, trust, the joy of discovery, and the simple pleasure of connection. Even as he drifted, the memory of sunlight filtering through leaves, the laughter shared in awkward attempts at building, and the taste of tea lingered within him, like echoes of a quiet song. That evening, as he lay in his pineapple bed, SpongeBob reflected on the day. The dome was no longer merely a strange structure. It had become a space of learning, of gentle growth, of shared presence. Even the air, which once seemed oppressive, now felt like a teacher, demanding attention but rewarding patience. He realized that adventure did not always come from grand quests or dramatic events. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the space between a stumble and a hand offered to steady, in the shared gaze of two unlikely friends, in the willingness to enter an unfamiliar world with an open heart. As sleep began to pull him under, he replayed the morning's moments in his mind, the careful arrangement of stones and sticks, the scuttling insects, the shimmering sunlight, the laughter that felt more like music than sound. He felt a soft certainty, like the current beneath the moonlit sea, that this connection would endure, that each visit would carry new lessons, new discoveries, new ways of being present in the world. With a gentle exhale, he let the thought settle, knowing that tomorrow would bring another opportunity to explore, to stumble, to learn, and to share quiet moments that mattered more than words could capture. The morning currents were calm as SpongeBob awoke, carrying with them a gentle promise that today would feel different, lighter somehow, as though the sea itself anticipated his journey. He stretched slowly, feeling the familiar pull of the water against his porous form, and let a quiet smile settle across his face. Yesterday's visit to the Treedome had left him thoughtful, lingering on details small and significant. The warm sunlight spilling through leaves, the subtle shifts of air, the rhythm of her hands as she guided him through a simple task. It was these nuances, these gentle lessons that he carried now, and they had begun to shape the way he moved through his own world. He drifted along the familiar paths toward the dome, noticing the subtle beauty of ordinary things. A cluster of coral glimmered in a way he hadn't paused to see before. A school of tiny fish weaved between swaying anemones like threads in a tapestry. He waved at passing neighbors, but his attention lingered on the quiet details, the shimmer of sunlight on water, the gentle sway of seaweed, the soft hum of life beneath the waves. He realized with a small thrill that his world had become richer, more textured, since the Treedome had entered his life. It was as though the threads of curiosity he carried had begun weaving themselves into every movement, every glance. When he arrived at the Treedome, he found her already waiting, as though she had anticipated his arrival. She smiled, the warmth in her eyes reflecting a calm certainty that made him feel instantly at ease. He pressed his hand to the glass, and she mirrored the gesture. There was a quiet conversation in that simple touch, a recognition of all the moments shared and all the lessons still unfolding. Today, however, the air felt heavier, more purposeful, as though it carried a subtle challenge he had not yet faced. Stepping through the hatch, SpongeBob was immediately aware of the shift. The Treedome seemed to breathe around him, sunlight filtering through leaves in long golden streaks. She gestured toward a section he had not yet explored, a small slope leading to a miniature garden she had cultivated. Tiny plants leaned toward the light, their leaves trembling slightly, and the soil was warm beneath his fingers. SpongeBob knelt to examine them, tracing patterns in the dirt, feeling the texture of the earth with a fascination that had grown deeper over repeated visits. She watched, eyes soft and patient, and without speaking, invited him into the rhythm of her care. Today, their interaction carried a quiet intensity. She demonstrated something new, the delicate act of tending plants, adjusting leaves, gently watering with precise movements. SpongeBob mimicked her, fumbling at first, spilling water in small arcs that glittered in the light. She laughed softly, a sound that mingled with the warmth of the dome, and guided his hands with gentle adjustments. Each touch was a lesson in patience, attention, and respect. SpongeBob began to understand that mastery was not the goal, presence was. The act of caring, the willingness to notice, to engage without rushing. These were the lessons he carried home in his heart. They moved slowly through the garden, pausing, to observe minute details, a leaf curling in the sunlight, a tiny beetle tracing an invisible path across the soil, a bud preparing to bloom. SpongeBob whispered observations, his voice filled with wonder, and she nodded, acknowledging the significance of his attention. He realized with a quiet awe that this world thrived in subtleties. It was a place where observation was itself, an act of connection, and each small gesture, each patient moment, carried a weight far greater than the sum of its parts. After tending to the garden, they returned to the familiar table for tea, but the ritual had deepened. The cup she poured for him steamed gently, carrying a delicate aroma of earth and sun-warmed leaves. SpongeBob sipped slowly, allowing the warmth to spread, not only through his body but through a sense of calm that settled around him. The dome felt alive with subtle rhythms, the rustle of leaves, the quiet hum of air moving, the gentle sway of light and shadow. He realized that these rhythms had become a part of him, shaping the way he observed and moved, even outside the dome. Time passed without the need for conversation. They simply existed together, sharing gestures, glances, and the gentle pulse of life that surrounded them. SpongeBob felt a sense of quiet growth, a realization that patience, observation, and attentiveness were themselves forms of courage. The dome had become more than a place of novelty. It was a space of learning, of reflection, and of shared understanding. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden, SpongeBob felt the familiar tug of the sea calling him back. He rose slowly, brushing dust from his hands, and she mirrored his movements. At the hatch, they shared a final gesture, pressing hands lightly to the glass once more. The touch was no longer tentative. It was an affirmation of trust, of recognition, and of the quiet bond they had nurtured through repeated, patient encounters. Returning to the ocean, SpongeBob let the currents guide him home, his thoughts full of the day's lessons. The water felt familiar yet subtly transformed, reflecting his own changes. He carried with him the gentle rhythm of the dome, the subtle lessons of observation, care, and trust. Each current, each sway of seaweed, each shimmer of light felt imbued with a newfound resonance. He understood now that growth came not from grand gestures, but from the patient, deliberate cultivation of attention, curiosity, and kindness. That evening, as he settled into his bed, SpongeBob reflected on the unfolding pattern of his visits. Each day brought subtle shifts, lessons hidden in quiet gestures, discoveries made in shared presence. He felt a profound sense of anticipation, not for some dramatic revelation, but for the continued unfolding of these delicate, meaningful moments. As sleep began to pull him under, he replayed the garden, the sunlit leaves, the laughter and guidance and the quiet, steady bond that had grown between them. And as the gentle tides of dreams began to carry him, SpongeBob felt certain that these threads of connection, patience and wonder would continue to weave through his life. The Treedome, once strange and distant, had become a vessel of growth and understanding. Each visit was a step along a quiet journey, a journey of discovery, not of grand adventure, but of subtle, enduring truths that attention, care, and presence could transform even the most unfamiliar spaces into home, and that trust, once nurtured, could span the boundaries between worlds. The morning was gentle, the current slow and deliberate, as if the sea itself were allowing SpongeBob the space to prepare for what awaited him. He awoke with a quiet awareness, a subtle flutter of anticipation in his chest, not from expectation of something dramatic, but from the knowledge that today would hold moments worth noticing. He stretched, feeling the familiar tug of water across his skin, and allowed himself to breathe deeply, savoring the rhythm of his own body as it aligned with the soft pulse of the ocean. The journey to the Treedome felt familiar, but each step through the water carried the weight of discovery. Coral shimmered softly in the morning light, and SpongeBob paused to watch a school of fish weave through the currents, their movements precise and effortless. The ordinary beauty of these small things struck him anew. He realized that his eyes had begun to see differently, attuned now to subtleties he had once overlooked. Each ripple, each glint of sunlight, each gentle sway of seaweed seemed to whisper a lesson about patience, attention, and quiet presence. Arriving at the dome, he pressed a hand to the glass, and she was already there, smiling, waiting with that calm, steady warmth that had become a comfort to him. Today, she gestured toward a small section of the dome he had only glimpsed before, a series of tiny platforms, rocks, and plants arranged like a miniature landscape. The sunlight fell in patterns across the space, shifting gently as it moved, casting fleeting shadows over leaves and stones. SpongeBob approached cautiously, aware that this part of the dome would challenge him in a new way, not with danger, but with unfamiliarity. She demonstrated first, moving with careful precision from platform to platform, adjusting leaves and stones as she went, creating balance and rhythm within the miniature world. SpongeBob watched intently, noticing the subtle shifts in her posture, the patience in her gestures, the quiet intention in every movement. Then she gestured for him to try. He stepped forward slowly, balancing one foot, then the other, feeling the shift of air and the unevenness of the surfaces beneath him. He faltered once, then again, laughter bubbling from his lips as he regained his footing. She smiled, encouraging, patient, and he realized that the small stumbles were as meaningful as the successful steps. As he moved through the miniature landscape, adjusting leaves and balancing stones, he felt a quiet transformation within himself. The act of paying attention, of moving deliberately and with care, began to ripple outward, affecting his perception of the dome, of the air, and even of his own thoughts. He realized that growth was not always marked by achievement or mastery, but by the willingness to engage fully, to stumble and recover, to notice details that might otherwise pass unnoticed. Each step, each careful adjustment, became a meditation, a practice in presence, patience, and trust. After working through the miniature landscape, they returned to the table for tea, but today it was a quiet ritual filled with reflection. SpongeBob held the warm cup, savoring not only the taste, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of the moment. He noticed how the sunlight caught on the edges of the cup, how a leaf trembled slightly in a gentle draught, how the dome itself seemed to breathe along with him. The air, once strange and challenging, had become a teacher, shaping his awareness, his attention, and his ability to move with care and thoughtfulness. They shared a long silence, broken only by soft laughter when SpongeBob spilled a little tea while gesturing excitedly about some observation he had made in the landscape. She laughed with him, her eyes warm, and he felt a deep gratitude for the way she nurtured his curiosity without judgment, guiding him with gentle hands and an open heart. In that quiet companionship, he understood that connection was built not in grand gestures, but in these repeated, patient, and attentive moments. As the light began to fade, casting soft shadows across the dome, SpongeBob felt the familiar tug of the sea, a reminder that he would soon return home. He rose slowly, careful with his movements, and she mirrored him, standing beside the table. At the hatch, they pressed their hands to the glass once more, a gesture rich with recognition, trust, and the quiet bond that had grown over repeated visits. It was a farewell that carried not sadness, but a soft certainty that their connection would endure, continuing to shape both of them in subtle,
meaningful ways. Back in the ocean, SpongeBob floated gently,
letting the currents carry him toward home. The water felt both familiar and subtly transformed, reflecting the growth he carried within himself. Each ripple seemed to mirror the lessons he had learned: patience, attention, trust, and the joy of discovering beauty in unexpected places. Even the most ordinary aspects of the sea now held a quiet resonance, a reflection of the care and presence he had cultivated within the dome. That evening, as he lay in his little pineapple bed, SpongeBob replayed the day in his mind. The miniature landscape, the careful balance of leaves and stones, the sunlight shifting across the dome, the laughter and gentle guidance, they wove together into a tapestry that felt both delicate and enduring. He felt a quiet anticipation for tomorrow, knowing that each visit would continue to reveal new subtleties, new lessons, and new moments of connection. As sleep began to pull him under, he let his thoughts drift into the gentle rhythm of the currents, carrying with them the soft certainty that growth, connection, and understanding were cultivated in patient, repeated steps. The Treedome, once a strange and unfamiliar world, had become a vessel of learning, presence, and quiet wonder, and within that knowledge, SpongeBob allowed himself to rest, drifting into dreams filled with sunlight, laughter, and the enduring pulse of life shared in gentle companionship. The water outside his pineapple shimmered softly as SpongeBob awoke, carrying with him a quiet sense of purpose. The Treedome had become more than just a strange, air-filled world. It was a place of lessons hidden in patience, observation, and gentle presence. He stretched, letting the currents cradle him, and felt the familiar tug of anticipation, a soft thrill that had nothing to do with haste or urgency. Today felt different, though he could not yet name why. There was a subtle weight in the air, an invitation to notice more deeply, to move with care, and to meet the unfamiliar with trust rather than hesitation. As he floated toward the Treedome, SpongeBob allowed himself to absorb the details of the sea around him. A school of tiny fish danced in unison, their movements delicate, almost choreographed. Coral caught the morning light, casting shimmering patterns across the sand. Even the smallest sway of seaweed seemed purposeful, each curve and bend a lesson in subtle motion. He realized with a soft thrill of awareness that he had begun to see differently. His curiosity was no longer raw or chaotic, but tuned to the rhythms and whispers of life around him. When he arrived at the dome, she was already there, tending to a cluster of small plants near the edge of the sunlight. Her hands moved with careful precision, adjusting leaves and brushing away dust from tiny stems, and SpongeBob felt a quiet awe at the reverence she held for even the smallest details. He pressed his hand to the glass, and she met him with a soft smile and a lifted hand, acknowledging his presence without words. Step by step, he entered the dome, feeling the air press differently against him,
as though it carried the weight of subtle instruction. Today,
she guided him toward a small section of the dome where light fell in shifting patterns across tiny platforms and plants. It was a miniature ecosystem, delicate and intricate, demanding attention and care. She demonstrated first, moving slowly from one platform to the next, adjusting stones and plants with precise, deliberate gestures. SpongeBob watched, absorbing the rhythm of her movement, noticing the intention behind each touch, the patience that allowed small corrections to flow naturally rather than forcefully. Then, gently, she encouraged him to try. He stepped forward carefully, balancing across the uneven platforms, feeling the strange pull of air against his body. He stumbled once, then again, laughter bubbling up as he caught himself. She smiled, soft and encouraging, guiding his hands with subtle adjustments. Each misstep was met not with correction, but with gentle support, allowing him to learn through touch, observation, and persistence. He felt himself growing, stretching in quiet ways, adapting to the unfamiliar, learning to inhabit the dome fully while honoring its delicate rhythm. As he moved among the miniature platforms and plants, SpongeBob realized that these lessons extended beyond balance and coordination. They were lessons in patience, presence, and trust. Trust in himself, in the dome, and in the quiet guidance of someone who believed in him. Each careful placement of a stone, each adjustment of a leaf became a meditation, a moment of connection to the subtle life around him. He whispered to himself softly, noticing patterns, textures, and the tiny pulses of energy in each movement. The dome, he understood, was teaching him not just about plants or air, but about living with awareness and intention. Afterward, they returned to the familiar table for tea, the ritual now carrying layers of reflection. SpongeBob held the warm cup in his hands, letting the aroma of flowers and earth rise gently into his senses. The air seemed to hum softly, vibrating with the subtle patterns of movement he had observed in the miniature landscape. He realized that every gesture, every moment of attention contributed to the harmony of the space. And in that awareness he found a quiet joy, a sense of accomplishment not in mastery, but in engagement, presence, and understanding. Time stretched gently, filled with the soft rhythm of shared observation. They sat together in silence, broken occasionally by laughter when SpongeBob's clumsy attempts at mimicking her movements sent a tiny stone tumbling. She laughed with him, the sound warm and musical, and he felt a swell of gratitude for her patient guidance and gentle encouragement. In this quiet companionship, he understood that connection was not forged in grand gestures, but in repeated moments of attention, care, and shared presence. As the sun began to lower, casting long, soft shadows across the dome, SpongeBob felt the familiar pull of the sea, reminding him that he would soon return to water and home. He rose slowly, brushing dust from his hands, and she mirrored his movements, standing beside him at the hatch. Their hands met once more against the glass, a gesture full of recognition, trust, and the quiet bond that had grown over countless visits. It was a farewell that carried neither sadness nor urgency, just the soft assurance of continuity, a promise that the subtle lessons and shared moments would endure. Back in the ocean, SpongeBob floated gently, the currents embracing him with familiar warmth. He reflected on the day, on the miniature landscape, the deliberate movements, the gentle laughter, and the patient guidance he had received. Even the ordinary elements of the sea now held new significance: the sway of seaweed, the shimmer of sunlight through water, the slow movements of creatures near and far. Each ripple mirrored the quiet growth he had experienced, reminding him that adventure and discovery need not be loud or spectacular to be meaningful. That evening, as he lay in his little pineapple bed, SpongeBob replayed the day's moments with care, letting them settle into his mind and heart. The miniature platforms, the shifting light, the laughter, and the quiet guidance became threads weaving together, forming a tapestry of learning, connection, and gentle growth. He felt a soft anticipation for tomorrow, knowing that the domes still held mysteries to explore, lessons to learn, and quiet joys to experience. As sleep drew near, SpongeBob let his thoughts drift on the gentle rhythm of the currents, carrying with them the awareness that presence, attention, and patience could transform even the most unfamiliar spaces into realms of comfort and growth. The Treedome, once a place of strangeness, had become a vessel of reflection, learning, and quiet wonder. And within that knowledge, he allowed himself to rest, drifting into dreams filled with sunlight, laughter, and the enduring pulse of life shared in gentle companionship. The morning light filtered through the water like a soft promise, and SpongeBob awoke with a gentle, steady curiosity. The Treedome had become more than a strange, air-filled structure. It was a place where subtle lessons waited in every corner, where growth was measured not in grand accomplishments, but in quiet awareness. He stretched slowly, letting the currents embrace him, and felt the familiar pulse of anticipation, not urgent, not demanding, but soft, insistent, like a whispered invitation. Today, he sensed, would reveal something he had not yet fully noticed. The journey to the dome carried the usual comforts, the familiar shapes of coral, the gentle sway of seaweed, the tiny fish weaving intricate patterns in the morning light. SpongeBob paused often, observing details he had once overlooked: the shimmer of sunlight across sand grains, the delicate dance of bubbles rising through the water, the faint hum of life that threaded through the currents. He had begun to see his world differently, noticing rhythms and subtleties that had always existed but had previously escaped his awareness. Arriving at the dome, he pressed a hand to the glass, and she was already there, tending to a small arrangement of plants bathed in sunlight. Her presence radiated calm, patience, and an unspoken encouragement. When she lifted her hand to meet his, he felt a comforting warmth, a quiet acknowledgement of the growing bond that had formed between them. Step by step he entered the dome, feeling the air press differently against him, heavier yet welcoming, like an embrace that demanded careful attention. She led him toward a corner of the dome he had only glimpsed before, a delicate section of tiny stones, plants and miniature pathways arranged with deliberate precision. Sunlight spilled through the leaves, creating shifting patterns across the space, and SpongeBob approached with measured steps, aware that this part of the dome required care and patience. She demonstrated first, moving gently from stone to leaf, adjusting positions with deliberate grace, and he watched intently, absorbing the rhythm of her movements and the thought behind each touch. When she invited him to try, SpongeBob moved cautiously, balancing across the uneven platforms and adjusting tiny elements along the way. He faltered occasionally, laughter escaping him as he regained his footing, and she smiled softly, guiding his hands with quiet encouragement. Each small mistake became part of the learning, each careful correction a lesson in patience and observation. He realized that growth was not about perfection, but about presence, the act of noticing, engaging, and moving deliberately through each moment. As he worked through the miniature space, SpongeBob began to feel a subtle shift within himself. Attention and care, once simple acts, now carried weight. Each movement, each observation, each breath was a thread in a larger pattern he was only beginning to perceive. He whispered softly to himself, noting the shapes, textures, and rhythms of the tiny ecosystem, and felt a sense of wonder bloom quietly in his chest. The dome was no longer simply a place of novelty. It had become a space of reflection, mindfulness, and quiet discovery. Afterward, they returned to the familiar table for tea, and this time the ritual carried a different depth. SpongeBob cradled the warm cup, savoring not just the flavor, but the rhythm of the moment itself. The soft hum of air, the flicker of sunlight, the subtle motion of leaves in a gentle draft. He understood now that even ordinary gestures could be profound when performed with awareness, and that connection was fostered not in grand acts, but in repeated, gentle attentions. She watched him with a quiet satisfaction, acknowledging his growing presence and understanding without the need for words. Time passed with soft rhythm, filled with silent observation, punctuated by gentle laughter whenever SpongeBob's careful placement of a stone or leaf did not go as planned. She laughed with him, warm and encouraging, and he felt a swell of gratitude for her patience, her guidance, and her trust. In those repeated, deliberate moments, he understood that connection was woven through subtle gestures, shared attention, and patient engagement. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, soft shadows across the dome, SpongeBob felt the familiar tug of the sea calling him back. He rose slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his hands, and she mirrored him, standing beside him at the hatch. Their hands met once more against the glass, a gesture full of recognition, trust, and the quiet bond that had grown over countless visits. It was a farewell that carried not sadness, but the soft assurance that the lessons, the laughter,
and the connection would endure. Back in the ocean,
SpongeBob floated gently, letting the currents guide him home. The water felt familiar, yet subtly transformed, reflecting the quiet growth he had nurtured within himself. Each ripple, each sway of seaweed, each glint of sunlight on sand seemed imbued with meaning, a reminder of the patient attention, care, and presence he had cultivated within the dome. He realized that even ordinary days could hold profound discoveries when approached with awareness and openness. That evening, as he lay in his pineapple bed, SpongeBob reflected on the unfolding rhythm of his visits. The miniature pathways, the shifting sunlight, the laughter, and the gentle guidance of his friend had become threads in a growing tapestry of understanding, patience, and connection. He felt a soft anticipation for the days ahead, knowing that each visit would continue to offer lessons, surprises, and moments of quiet joy. As sleep drew near, he let his thoughts drift,
carried by the gentle pulse of the sea, the warmth of sunlight,
and the enduring rhythm of shared presence. The Treedome, once a strange and unfamiliar place, had become a vessel of learning, reflection, and quiet wonder. And within that knowledge, SpongeBob allowed himself to rest, drifting into dreams filled with sunlight, laughter, and the enduring heartbeat of life shared in gentle companionship. The sea was unusually still that morning, as though it too was pausing to listen. SpongeBob floated outside his pineapple, feeling the hush in the water, the way even the smallest bubbles seemed to drift more slowly than usual. It was not silence exactly, but a kind of quietness that pressed gently against him, encouraging him to move softly, to carry himself with care. He felt a subtle pull, not of urgency, but of invitation, an unseen current leading him once more toward the Treedome. The journey was familiar, yet every detail felt slightly heightened. A trail of jellyfish glided gracefully overhead, their bodies glowing faintly with the rising light. Corals stretched upward like soft towers, catching fragments of sun in hues of pink and gold. Even the sand sparkled faintly beneath his feet, as though small stories were etched into its shifting surface. SpongeBob moved slowly, noticing, absorbing, carrying each detail as if it were part of a puzzle that would make sense in time. When he reached the Treedome, she was already waiting. This time, she stood not by her plants or tools, but at the very center of the dome, still and calm, her gaze lifted toward the roof, where light filtered through in cascading beams. SpongeBob pressed his hand to the glass as he always did, but she did not move immediately to meet him. Instead, she gestured softly, a gentle beckon, as though today's lesson was already underway. With deliberate care, he stepped inside. The air felt different today. Not heavier, not lighter, simply more present, more aware, as though the dome itself had settled into a thoughtful mood. SpongeBob breathed slowly, letting the strange rhythm of air fill him, and followed her to the middle. She handed him nothing this time, no tool, no plant, no stone to balance. Instead, she placed her hand lightly against his chest, just above his heart, and then stepped back, her eyes meeting his with wordless intention. At first, he did not understand. He stood uncertain, shifting his weight, glancing around for guidance. But then he noticed the way she closed her eyes, the way her shoulders rose and fell with deep, steady breaths. He mirrored her, closing his own eyes, listening to the rhythm of his inhale, his exhale, the gentle hum of the dome around him. The lesson, he realized, was not about doing, it was about being, about noticing the currents within himself as much as those outside. The moment stretched, soft and unbroken. At first, SpongeBob's mind scattered, thoughts of Krabby Patties, jellyfish fields, chores waiting at home. But the longer he stood, the more those thoughts drifted away, carried like bubbles to the edges of his awareness. What remained was the steady beat of his heart, the subtle rise and fall of his chest, and the faint echo of her breathing across the dome. They were not speaking, but something was shared. An understanding beyond words, a closeness made of silence. When she finally opened her eyes, SpongeBob did too, and he noticed the dome differently. The light above seemed warmer, fuller. The plants at the edges swayed gently, even in the still air, as though touched by an invisible hand. He realized that quietness was not empty. It was alive, full of presence, of subtle movements and hidden rhythms. The dome had been teaching him all along, but today it had revealed its softest, simplest truth, that stillness itself was a form of connection. They did not speak much afterward. They did not need to. She poured tea, the steam rising in delicate ribbons, and SpongeBob held his cup carefully, feeling the warmth spread through his hands, his chest, his mind. Each sip tasted richer, not because the tea had changed, but because he had. He had learned to drink slowly, to notice the way flavor unfolded across his tongue, to let the warmth linger before swallowing. Even tea, he realized, carried lessons in presence, patience, and care. As the day moved forward, they tended together to small tasks, watering, adjusting, observing. Their movements were unhurried, deliberate, and yet suffused with an ease that made the hours flow gently. SpongeBob felt himself relax into the rhythm, into the companionship that did not need constant conversation. He thought of how often he had rushed before, eager to finish, to succeed, to prove. But here, with her, he was learning that the heart of living was not in rushing forward, but in resting within the moment. When it was time to leave, SpongeBob lingered by the glass, his hand pressed lightly against it as hers met his on the other side. This time, he did not feel the usual pull of departure.
Instead, he carried a calm assurance, a recognition that their bond was not measured by distance or closeness, but by the quiet trust that lingered between them.
He smiled softly, and she returned the smile, their eyes sharing a quiet promise that needed no words. As he drifted home through the sea, SpongeBob felt lighter, yet more grounded, as though something within him had settled into place. The water around him seemed alive with subtle whispers, and he moved not as a creature hurrying from one place to the next, but as a being walking slowly through a sacred, endless room. The world had not changed, but he had, and because of that, everything shimmered differently. That night, as he rested in his pineapple bed, he thought of her hand pressed gently against his chest, reminding him of the rhythm within. He thought of the stillness they had shared, the way silence had spoken louder than words. And as his eyelids grew heavy, he whispered softly to himself, as if to carry the lesson into sleep. Even in quiet, there is life. The thought cradled him like a lullaby, and he drifted gently into dreams filled with slow-moving currents, beams of light, and the tender hum of companionship that asked for nothing more than presence. The next morning unfolded with a kind of softness that SpongeBob had come to recognize, a quiet invitation rather than a command. The sea around him seemed calm but alive, each ripple carrying its own slow song. He moved gently through the water, not hurrying, letting his arms drift at his sides as the current carried him closer to the Treedome. He thought about the stillness of yesterday, about the way silence had shaped itself into meaning, and wondered what the dome might reveal to him today. When he arrived, she was waiting again, though this time her posture carried a subtle difference. She stood near the edge of the dome with a basket at her feet, gathering objects from the ground, small stones, twigs, shells. She held each one as though it mattered, turning it in her hands before placing it gently in the basket. SpongeBob watched for a while, fascinated by the way she treated even the simplest things as treasures. When she noticed him at the glass, her smile was quiet, knowing. She beckoned him inside, and he obeyed with the same gentle anticipation that had grown into habit. The air inside was steady and familiar now, and yet it always seemed to surprise him in small ways. Today it felt warm, touched by sunlight streaming through the glass, carrying with it the faint scent of soil and flowers. She handed him the basket, letting its weight rest in his hands. It wasn't heavy, but he noticed how each item inside shifted against the others, shells clicking softly, stones pressing together. She gestured for him to follow her, and they walked slowly to the center of the dome, where a low table waited. One by one, she began to take the objects from the basket and arrange them across the table. A smooth stone here, a shell with ridges there, a twig placed carefully beside a leaf. SpongeBob copied her, fumbling at first, placing things too quickly or stacking them unevenly. She watched, smiling, then gently moved his hands to slow him down. Her guidance was not about correction, it was about attention, about encouraging him to see the objects not just as things, but as carriers of shape, color, story. As the arrangement grew, SpongeBob began to notice how the objects spoke to each other. The curve of one shell seemed to echo the bend of a twig. A pale stone caught the light in the same way as a smooth leaf beside it. Nothing was perfect, nothing symmetrical, but somehow the collection came alive when placed with care. He felt a quiet wonder at how ordinary pieces overlooked in the sea could create something beautiful simply by being noticed. They sat together for a long time, arranging and rearranging, not with urgency, but with playfulness. SpongeBob laughed softly when a shell toppled from its place, and she laughed too, her voice light and easy. It wasn't about building something grand or lasting, it was about the act itself, the presence, the shared rhythm of hands moving together. He thought then of how often he rushed through life, eager for big moments, and realized that perhaps the smaller moments had always been the real treasures. When they finished, the table was covered in a quiet mosaic of shells, stones and twigs, each piece resting in harmony with the others. SpongeBob felt a swell of pride, not because it looked perfect, but because it felt alive, filled with the care and attention they had poured into it. She gestured for him to sit back, to observe, and as he did, he noticed something he hadn't expected. The arrangement seemed to reflect them, their patience, their laughter, their bond. It was a mirror not of appearance, but of presence. They shared tea again, though the tea seemed almost secondary now. It was the pause, the warmth, the togetherness that mattered most. SpongeBob held his cup close, inhaling deeply, and felt the fragrance blend with the earthy scent of the dome. Each sip carried the same gentle lesson: to slow down, to notice, to receive what the moment offered. As the day began to wane, she lifted one of the shells from the arrangement and placed it in SpongeBob's hand. It was small, ridged, simple, but he felt its weight with reverence. He understood without words. It was a gift, a reminder to carry the lessons beyond the dome. His eyes softened, and he nodded, pressing the shell gently to his chest before tucking it carefully away. Their eyes met, and in that gaze was an unspoken acknowledgement that what they were building together was not made of shells or stones, but of moments of trust, of presence. The farewell was quiet, their hands meeting once more against the glass. But this time SpongeBob carried something tangible with him. As he floated home, the shell in his pocket tapped lightly with each movement, a soft rhythm that reminded him of the dome, the laughter, the stillness, the mosaic they had made. The sea around him felt alive in new ways. Every pebble on the ocean floor seemed to hum with hidden stories. Every current whispered of unseen connections. That night, in his pineapple bed, SpongeBob took the shell out and placed it beside him. He watched its ridges catch the faint light, and he thought of her hands arranging stones and leaves with care. He thought of how something small could hold so much meaning when treated with love. And as he drifted into sleep, he whispered to himself, "Even the smallest things can carry the whole world." The shell seemed to glow faintly in the dark, or perhaps it was only his imagination, but either way, it comforted him as he sank into dreams soft and deep. The whispers of Kagranak's secrets had spread across Tamriel long before the tribunal seized hold of the heart, and by the time their power was solidified, the Mer of Morrowind lived in a strange tension between awe and unease. They revered Almalexia's beauty, Vivek's wisdom, and Sothasil's arcane mastery, yet beneath that reverence was the uneasy knowledge that their gods had risen not through divine gift, but through craft and boldness, by chaining a force that had never been meant to be wielded by mortals. This knowledge lingered in the minds of scholars and heretics alike, a shadow stretching across the brilliance of their golden reign. The heart was no ordinary relic, and though the tribunal declared it a sacred fountain of renewal and strength, some wondered whether they had not bound themselves to a flame too great to control. That tension only deepened with the years, for as the tribunal grew more radiant and more terrifying in their majesty, their dependence upon the heart became more visible, woven into the very rhythm of their rule. The people were not blind to the pattern. Every year, in secret rites beneath Red Mountain, the tribunal would vanish into the cavernous chambers where the heart pulsed like the buried heartbeat of the world. Their absences were explained with proclamations of Holy Communion, of divine renewal, and though the common accepted these words with bowed heads, the wise knew better. Without the heart, the tribunal's godhood waned, their flesh beginning to tire, their will beginning to falter. It was not so much divinity they carried, but a covenant of theft, renewed again and again in hidden rituals. Whispers travelled through the great houses and into the ears of restless souls, who began to wonder whether the tribunal's power was truly eternal or merely borrowed. And in that wondering, the first cracks in their unshakable dominion were sown. Among these murmurs rose cults, both secret and bold, some venerating the Daedra, others holding to the old Velothi faith, and still others daring to dream of the return of the long-dead Dwemer, whose disappearance had become a silence too vast to ignore. For it was not lost on the wise that the tribunal's divinity had begun with Dwemer hands, that Kagranak's tools and Kagranak's heart had birthed the godhood of three who now claimed to rule as divine shepherds. The irony was sharp and bitter. The very people who had warred against the Dwemer now knelt in reverence to a trinity born of Dwemer craft. And though the tribunal crushed dissent where it arose, though their sermons spoke of harmony and divine order, the questions refused to die. How long could stolen divinity endure before the weight of its theft demanded recompense? Vivek, more than any of the three, understood the danger of these doubts. His sermons grew increasingly intricate, weaving history, myth, and prophecy into one seamless fabric meant to bind the minds of his people. He spoke of his birth, of his union of opposites, of his walk between mortal and immortal, and in his words he sought not only to inspire, but to conceal. His genius was in narrative, in transforming the tribunal's dependence upon the heart into a mystery too sacred to question. Yet, even as he spoke, he knew that truth remained a dangerous ember, one that no sermon, however elaborate, could ever fully extinguish. Almalexia cloaked her fading strength in pageantry, surrounding herself with rituals of light and healing, appearing always as the eternal mother whose radiance could never dim. Sothasil retreated further into his endless machines, perhaps to seek a way to sever their need for the heart, perhaps to create new divinities altogether. But the cycle remained unbroken. They returned to the heart, they drew its stolen fire, and for another span of years their reign endured. Time, however, is patient, and even gods bound to stolen eternity could not still its slow erosion. The heart, though bound and struck by Kagranak's tools, remained an echo of Lorcan's will, a force that had been cursed by the other gods for daring to bring mortality into being. Such a force was not meant to be harnessed without consequence. Subtly, invisibly at first, it began to twist the tribunal. Almalexia's gentleness grew sharp with pride and suspicion, her radiant love darkening into possessiveness. Sothasil's genius curdled into obsession, his machines less. Works of wonder than desperate attempts to hold dominion over inevitability. And Vivek, caught between his contradictions, began to waver between poetry and cruelty, vision and despair. Each felt the creeping corruption differently, yet each was bound by the same tether, unable to release the heart and unwilling to admit how deeply it had already altered them. The people, too, began to sense this change. The tribunal's decrees grew harsher, their presence more distant, their miracles tinged with unease. What once inspired awe now carried a weight of fear, and though temples still filled with incense and prayer, devotion began to taste of duty rather than joy. The faith that had once bound Morrowind in unity began to fracture as Daedric cults gained strength in the shadows, whispering promises that the tribunal could no longer provide. Still, No open rebellion came, for the memory of their wrath was terrible, and even in their fading, they were power beyond comprehension. Yet the seeds had been planted, and seeds, given time, always grow. What made their situation most precarious was not the doubts of their people, nor even the whispers of heresy, but the knowledge that beyond Morrowind the world shifted restlessly. The Empire, ever watchful, regarded the tribunal with a mix of suspicion and respect, knowing that within their mountain lay a power too vast to ignore. The Daedra, whose shrines still flickered with worship across Tamriel, stirred with interest at the faltering of false gods. And deep beneath the surface, in the veins of the world, where Dwemer's secrets still hummed in silence, the memory of Kagranak's craft lingered like an unclosed wound. The tribunal, for all their radiance, stood upon fragile ground, bound to a relic they could neither forsake nor fully command. It was a balance as delicate as a sword's edge, and the longer they walked it, the sharper it cut. And so their reign entered a new stage, one of subtle decline masked by splendor, of ceremonies that grew grander even as their source of power grew less stable. The tribunal still strode through their cities like gods, their voices still shook the air with command, their hands still shaped miracles before the eyes of mortals. But beneath the golden glory lay an unspoken truth. They were not eternal. Their godhood was not unassailable. It was bound to a heart that had its own will, its own history, its own curse. And though they dared not speak it, though they hid it beneath sermons, pageants, and silence, each of them knew what their people could only suspect, that their end would not come from without, but from within, from the very source that had made them divine. The tension that had for so long lingered beneath the surface of Morrowind now began to press outward, manifesting in ways the tribunal could no longer entirely control. It started quietly, in whispers traded in the backrooms of taverns and in the shadows of shrines, where Daedric idols still stood, their forms dimmed but not forgotten. Pilgrims who once travelled to the great temples began to divide their journeys, offering prayers not only to Vivec, Almalexia, and Sothasil, but also to the old patrons who had guided their ancestors through exile and hardship, Azura, Mephala, Boethia. It was not open defiance at first, only a hedging of devotion, a safeguard for uncertain days. Yet the tribunal felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, as though a tide had begun to turn beneath the surface of still waters. Almalexia was the first to respond, her temples blazing with renewed displays of glory. She commanded her priests to weave miracles before the crowds, to heal the sick and feed the hungry, to cloak her image in the warmth of eternal light. Her processions through the streets of Mournhold grew more frequent, each one a dazzling spectacle meant to remind her people that she was the mother of their nation, the radiant flame who would never falter. Yet beneath the brilliance her eyes grew harder, her smile sharper, for she knew such efforts were but masks for a truth she could not banish. Her strength waned when too long parted from the heart, and though she would never admit it, the devotion she demanded was no longer born of endless abundance, but of dwindling reserves desperately rationed. Sothasil, by contrast, withdrew deeper into his clockwork city, allowing the world outside to fall increasingly silent to him. What little word escaped his hidden refuge spoke of endless experiments, of machines more intricate and more terrible than any before. Some whispered that he sought a way to replicate the heart's power, to craft a source of divinity, not bound to Red Mountain, but forged by his own hand. Others murmured darker tales, that he had begun to create life itself, twisting flesh and brass together in an attempt to escape mortality entirely. None could say with certainty, for Sothasil had become a myth within his own lifetime, and his silence left more questions than answers. Yet his absence from the stage of public faith was keenly felt, and in that absence, doubt only grew. It was Vivek who alone still stood between the tribunal and collapse. He spoke with poetry and paradox, weaving tales that made contradiction seem divine truth. His sermons grew stranger, filled with riddles of past and future, myth and memory. He cast himself as the warrior poet, the teacher, the lover, the betrayer, the God who walked with his people, yet remained apart. And for a time it worked. Pilgrims still came to his temple, still hung upon his words, still believed that through his vision the world retained order. Yet even Vivek could not silence the restless undercurrent. His contradictions, once dazzling, began to taste of evasion. His riddles, once inspiring, began to feel like concealments. And those who listened closely began to sense the anxiety behind his words, the knowledge that even he could not bind the truth forever. The first open challenge came not from foreign powers nor Daedric princes, but from within Morrowind itself. A sect of dissidents, emboldened by the growing cracks in the tribunal's aura, declared openly that the three were false gods. They claimed that their power came not from divinity but from theft, from the profane use of dwemercraft, and that their rule was a mockery of true faith. They called themselves the dissident priests, and though small at first, their words carried weight. They did not deny the tribunal's power, they acknowledged it as terrible and real, but they declared it unnatural, unsanctioned, a betrayal of Veloth's sacred path. And their heresies spread, not because it offered comfort, but because it spoke aloud the suspicions many already carried in silence. The tribunal responded with fury. Temples were cleansed, texts burned, heretics silenced. Almalexia's followers marched upon gatherings of the dissidents, scattering them with holy fire. Vivek wrote sermons denouncing them as liars, weaving their rebellion into his vast tapestry of myth as another trial to be overcome. Yet, for every voice silenced, two more seemed to rise, and the dissidents only grew bolder. They hid in secret libraries, smuggling forbidden texts, preserving truths the tribunal sought to erase. And though their numbers were few compared to the faithful, their presence was a wound that would not close, a constant reminder that the tribunal's divinity was not unassailable. Beyond Morrowind's borders, the shifting balance of power did not go unnoticed. The Empire, always eager for footholds in distant lands, began to probe the cracks in the tribunal's authority. Envoys came bearing gifts and flatteries, but behind their smiles lay calculation. They saw in the tribunal's reliance upon the heart a vulnerability, and in the rise of dissident voices an opportunity. The Daedra too stirred more openly, their cults emboldened by the tribunal's faltering grip. Azura, above all, seemed to whisper louder, her presence weaving through dreams and visions, calling her faithful back to her with promises that the tribunal's false divinity would not endure. And so the balance began to tilt, ever so slightly toward inevitable confrontation. The tribunal still held their godhood, still commanded armies and miracles, still shone with power that no mortal could deny. But their dependence upon the heart had become an open secret, their splendor a mask stretched thin over fear. The people's devotion, once unquestioning, had become fractured, wary, hedged between gods new and old. Enemies beyond their borders watched with interest, and enemies within whispered with growing boldness. The tribunal had risen by daring to seize what no other mortals had ever dared. But that same theft had bound them to a cycle they could not escape. They were gods only so long as the heart endured, only so long as they returned to it in secret rites beneath the mountain. And though they strove to hide this truth, the world around them was beginning to piece it together. The age of unquestioned godhood was ending, and in its place came the slow and inexorable unraveling that would one day lead to their fall. The tribunal's decline did not arrive in a sudden collapse, but as a slow unraveling, a tapestry fraying thread by thread until its pattern could no longer be concealed. What began as whispers among the dissident priests soon grew into a chorus, quiet but insistent, reaching ears even in the heart of the temples. It was no longer merely heresy murmured in shadows. It was conversation held over market stalls, shared around hearths, passed along the pilgrim roads. The question was no longer if the tribunal's divinity was true, but how long it could last. Almalexia, with all her majesty, refused to yield an inch of her claim. She doubled her processions through the cities of Morrowind, her golden robes trailing like sunlight upon the cobblestones, her voice resounding with declarations of eternal grace. To her priests, she ordered swift judgment upon those who dared question her radiance. Temples rang with hymns louder than ever before, as though volume itself could drown out doubt. Yet, when she withdrew behind the closed doors of her sanctuaries, the flame in her eyes betrayed unease. Her miracles came more slowly now, each one costing her more than she would admit. The divine reservoir that had once flowed without end from Red Mountain seemed, at times, to thin. Sothasil remained apart, yet even his silence could not endure forever. Messengers sent to his clockwork city sometimes returned after months with cryptic words, and sometimes never returned at all. When his voice reached the tribunal, it was fractured, distant, as though he no longer spoke entirely from the world they inhabited. He warned of cycles, of inevitabilities, of truths too vast to name. He did not deny the crisis, but framed it as a part of something larger, a wheel turning beyond their control. His absence gnawed at Almalexia, whose fury at his detachment burned hotter with every unanswered summons. And then there was Vivek, the last thread holding together the semblance of unity. His sermons became longer, stranger, spiraling into riddles that seemed to swallow their own meaning. He sought to weave all contradictions into poetry, to make of confusion a kind of truth that could not be broken. To many he still succeeded. His words could cradle doubt into sleep. But to others, the beauty of his speech no longer sufficed. They wanted answers, not riddles. They wanted certainty, not poetry. And for the first time, even Vivek felt his voice falter when the questions grew too sharp. It was in this climate that the dissident priests took their boldest step. No longer content to preserve forbidden texts in hidden chambers, they began to gather openly, forging bonds with factions outside the tribunal's direct grasp. Scholars who remembered fragments of Dwemer law, merchants weary of temple taxes, even noble houses with grievances against the tribunal's rule, all found, in the words of the dissidents, a cause that spoke to their doubts. They called for truth, not merely obedience. They did not demand the fall of the tribunal outright, but rather a reckoning, a revelation of what lay beneath the mountain. And the more the tribunal resisted, the more convincing the dissidents became. The empire, ever watchful, leaned in with measured interest. Envoys whispered to the dissidents that freedom of faith could flourish under imperial law, that the weight of false gods might be lifted if the empire's hand were welcomed. To the tribunal, the empire spoke differently, offering friendship, treaties, and flattery, while quietly noting the growing storm beneath their reign. The Daedric cults too gained courage. Azura's voice, especially, was said to echo more strongly in dreams, calling the Dunmer back to the true faith of their ancestors, promising that the tribunal's reign was but a passing shadow compared to the starlight of eternity. Tension grew sharper still when rumors spread that Almalexia and Vivek no longer stood entirely united. Their quarrels, once private, began to slip through cracks in the facade. Some swore they heard their voices raised in the high halls of Mournhold, Almalexia demanding greater action against heretics while Vivek counseled patience, weaving yet more verses to soothe the people rather than wield the sword. Even Sothersil's silence seemed, in its own way, a form of dissent, as though he had already withdrawn into a truth they could not follow. Through it all, the heart of Lorcan pulsed within Red Mountain, unchanged, unyielding, the source of their godhood and their curse. They still returned to it in secret rites, still bound themselves to its rhythm, still drew from its endless well. Yet each visit seemed to leave them less whole, less certain, as though the very act of leaning upon it deepened the wound of their dependence. They were no longer the daring mortals who had seized divinity from the edge of time. They were weary rulers bound to a cycle they could not break. And so the stage was set. The tribunal still shone, still commanded armies, still carried the semblance of gods, but the veil was thinning. The people no longer feared to ask questions. The dissidents no longer feared to speak their truths. The Empire and the Daedra no longer feared to press their influence. The unraveling had begun, not with a great battle or sudden collapse, but with the quiet, persistent erosion of faith. A mountain does not fall all at once. It crumbles grain by grain until one day its shape is forever changed. And the tribunal, for all their might, could not stop the slow turning of that tide. The fall was still far ahead, yet its shadow had already begun to stretch across the land. Then let us let the tale fold itself shut like a book set down at the edge of sleep. The tribunal, for all their brilliance, were never as eternal as they wished to be. They had stolen a god's heart to clothe themselves in divinity, and in so doing had bound themselves to a rhythm they could not control. Their temples still stand in memory, their words still ripple through the dreams of Morrowind, but their reign was a season, not forever. Seasons always change, and yet what remains is not only their fall. What endures are the fragments of light they left behind, the warmth of Almalexia's care, however fierce, the impossible clockwork visions of Sothersil, strange and wondrous, the poetry of Vivek, whose riddles still sing across water and stone. Their story is not only about power lost, but about the tenderness of memory, the way a people learn to carry both faith and doubt within the same heart. Legends do not vanish. They soften like voices in the next room, like stars dissolving into dawn. And somewhere, in the endless dream that is history, the tribunals still walk. One in robes of gold, one in brass and shadow, one with a spear across his shoulder and a half-smile across his face. They are not gone, only quieter now. Perhaps that is how all stories end. Not with finality, but with a gentle exhale, an invitation to rest, to let go, to carry the echoes forward in silence. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's gonna be okay, man.